Hi everyone, I'm Shelly and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. I'm back with another video and today's topic is Sunday Best. Why do we wear what we wear? Today's video is the next installment in my book discussion on the book Pagan Christianity by Frank Viola and George Barna. And today we're going to be covering chapter 6, which is called Sunday Morning Costumes, Covering Up the Problem. As a child growing up, my mom always used to dress me up in these beautiful little dresses to go to church, especially on Easter Sunday when I would wear these little white gloves and this Easter hat or an Easter bonnet. And then I would have a little beaded purse with me that she always kept carefully wrapped in tissue paper and put away in a drawer. And it was only ever brought out for me to use on Easter Sunday. And some of my fondest memories are of those times. There's a picture of me and my older brother, who has now passed on, standing in front of our parents' car on Easter Sunday, me wearing my little crocheted poncho and Easter bonnet, holding my little purse, and my brother in his suit, which you very rarely saw him in. And, I never questioned, why do we dress up like we do for church? It should seem like a no-brainer. Aren't we showing reverence to the Lord when we dress up for church? And, I think that's why a lot of people do it. So just as with the last chapter and several of these chapters, I'm not here saying that any of these things are inherently bad. Because there are still times that I will dress up for church. Now, I don't dress up for church every Sunday. I have been known to wear jeans to church on a Sunday. I have been known even to wear sweatpants when I didn't get to do the laundry to church. Thankfully, most of the people in my church don't care what we wear. Some of them might think things but not actually say it. And that's one good thing about going to a very informal church. Even the pastor will wear jeans more often than not. So, with that being said, I want to share with you a quote from the beginning of this chapter, and it was actually Jesus Christ who said this in Luke 20, verse 46, when he said, "Beware of those who like to walk around in long robes." And of course, for context for this, he was speaking of the Pharisees, and we will get into that whole passage a little bit later. I'm sure I'm not the only one who ever thought about, why do people dress up for church on Sundays? I think that it's just something that we all just do. It's a tradition. But is it a tradition that comes from the Bible? And in fact, is it a tradition that might go against at least what the first century church did? Well, that's what we're going to be exploring today. Now, in this segment, I'm going to be using the terms clergy and laity, which I'm sure most of you know. And the terms clergy and laity in themselves are not even biblical and have no roots in the Bible. But I am going to use those terms today just to differentiate between what those in the congregation and what those in the clergy might sometimes wear. Now, most of what I'm going to be discussing regarding the clergy is going to be about the long gowns that many pastors and sometimes priests wear. Now, the church that I go to, again, my pastor does not wear a long gown normally. I think he will wear it when he baptizes people. He will put on like a white robe. But other than that, it's usually, sometimes a suit, but it's usually like jeans and a button-down shirt, and that's it. But, so when did this whole idea of dressing up for church begin? Believe it or not, that actually didn't begin until the late 18th century, and it began with the Industrial Revolution. Because up until that point, dressing up was something that only the very wealthy could do. They would do this for social events. And it was because they were the only ones who could afford nice clothing like that, because they weren't readily available. So common folks, those who were not extremely wealthy, they had two sets of clothes. They had work clothes, and then they had like lower clothes who were not as worn to go maybe to church or for going into town. But that all changed then with the Industrial Revolution. Once the Industrial Revolution began, there was the invention of these mass textile manufacturing factories. And there was just this whole development of this society in which, and I'm going to say this unfortunately, consumerism really began to rise. But my granddaughter's upstairs having a good old time. Anyway, these clothes that were originally only really for the very wealthy became much more, much easier for the people who were not so wealthy. They might have been like middle class, but they decided that they were going to start dressing up too, because they wanted to emulate that envied aristocracy. And what better place to do this than to demonstrate their, quote, newly improved status than by wearing those clothes to church. Now, there were some Christian groups who did resist this, and this was around the late 18th and early 19th century. John Wesley actually wrote against wearing expensive or flashy clothing. And the early Methodists, which is the denomination that was found by John Wesley, they resisted this idea so much, this idea of dressing up for church, that they actually turned away anyone who wore expensive clothing to their services, or whether you call them meetings. And also the early Baptists also condemned fine clothing because they said that it separated the rich from the poor. And I find that very interesting, because I have been to several Baptist churches, and not all of them are the same, but some of them, especially I think it's the Fundamentalist Baptist. Is there a Fundamentalist Baptist? Maybe Southern Baptist? At least the ones that I went to, it was all about just completely dressing to the nines. You know, all of the men wearing three-piece suits and all of the women wearing long skirts or dresses, and just everyone looking absolutely perfect. So when I read that, oops, I just dropped one of my books. When I read that the early Baptists also condemned this, I was actually a little bit surprised about that. Now, amidst, these people who were against dressing up for church, in 1843, a man named Horace Bushnell, who was an influential, and I'm taking this from page 147, an influential congregational minister in Connecticut, published an essay called Taste and Fashion. In it, Bushnell argued that sophistication and refinement were attributes of God, and that Christians should emulate them. Thus was born the idea of dressing up for church to honor God. And, that is where we get that idea. I was actually told when I was younger to think of it this way. I was taught that if you were going to visit an earthly king or an earthly president, for example, the president of the United States, how would you dress? Would you just wear a pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt? Would you wear just like a pair of jeans and a t-shirt? Or would you, dress up in the best manner that you possibly could? And I think most of us, if we would honestly answer that, no matter how we would feel about whoever we were going to meet, we would tend to dress up, in a fancier, way to present ourselves. And so they said, if you're going to dress like that for an earthly king, why would you not even more so want to dress like that for the King of all kings? And, that makes a lot of sense if you think of it in that way. I remember years ago, I don't remember what president it was. It might have been Obama, but I could be wrong. There was a team of I don't remember, I think it might have been female athletes who went to visit him at the White House, and there was a picture taken with all these athletes with the president, and a lot of the girls, they were wearing dresses, but they had flip-flops on. And people were just absolutely outraged, how dare they wear flip-flops to visit the president of the United States? And that is how a lot of people will get in churches. And I find that it is more with the older generations starting to get a little less formal. But yeah, a lot of times the older generations might look down their nose on those people who are not dressed up to the par that, these people who are of the generation of dressing for church as if you were going to visit the president. So there's this disconnect between the two separate groups. And like I said, for me, myself, I enjoy dressing up for church, and I do it sometimes. I don't always, though. And for me, honestly, I do it just because sometimes I like to look nice. I only wear makeup maybe once or twice a week when I'm going to church, and then maybe if I'm doing something else. If you would find me like at Walmart or anywhere else throughout the week, and people have from my channel who have met me at Walmart, and I'm there like no makeup on, looking like a total slob. So it is nice to look nice sometimes. And yeah, what better time to do that than when you are at church with hopefully what you consider to be your second family in a place that you really enjoy going to. But yeah, this just takes us right back to the beginning where, a lot of people, they get dressed up, they get suited up every Sunday, and they have no idea why they even do it. It's just something that's done. But according to the authors of this book, it has nothing to do with the Bible, Jesus Christ, or the Holy Spirit. And they said that it is what dressing up for church represents that is the burning issue. On page 140, I can't see if that's 48 or 49. It's so light. I know you probably hear me complain about the print in this book every single video. I can't help it. It's really hard to see. But anyway, if I could tell them to change anything, it would be that. They said on page 148, dressing up for church reflects the false division between the secular and the sacred. To think that God cares one whit if you wear dressy threads on Sunday to, quote, meet him, is a violation of the new covenant. We have access to God's presence at all times and in all circumstances. Does he really expect his people to dress up for a beauty pageant on Sunday morning? That really does make a lot of sense. We talked about the separation between the sacred and the secular in the last video, because unfortunately, that's the way that we do things on Sunday mornings. It really does contribute to that. And there should be no divide between the sacred and the secular for Christians. Being a believer is something that we should permeate everything that we do. But when we dress up just for worship on a Sunday, that's, again, just as with the other things that we've been talking about, in that way, sometimes it does solidify the attitude of just being a Sunday morning Christian, and then you kind of separate it from the rest of your weekly life. And, that's not something that we're supposed to be doing. Just as in the last video that I did, it said that the separation between clergy and laity also made this divide, because it made those who choose to be in the, quote, pastoral ministry, like their vocation is holy, while everyone else who does not do something in that manner or in that field would be considered just secular. And it's just like something completely different. But again, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what vocation we choose. It doesn't matter if we don't have a vocation, like I'm a stay-at-home mom. But there's nothing secular about being a Christian. Your faith should permeate everything that you do in life. And so, hopefully, if you are not a Sunday morning Christian, hopefully you are praying daily, hopefully more than once a day. Sometimes I'm not trying to put these, like little checklists to do, things that you must do. It should be something that comes naturally to you. And sometimes there might be times that you don't, but I know most of the time that I am praying, it is while I'm lying down to go to sleep. I'm in my pajamas. Do you think that God cares that I'm wearing a pair of pajama pants with a mismatched top in order to pray, in order to commune with him? No, I don't think that he cares one whit about that. And if we are believers, we should be living our lives in worship, not just our Sundays. Sundays should not be the only place that we worship. Everything that we do, we should be doing as unto the Lord. And so it doesn't mean that we have to be having a, quote, church service in our house every single day. But the way that we live our lives, the things that we think about, these are also acts of worship. And it does not matter what we're wearing when we're doing these things. So, according to the authors, wearing our Sunday best conceals a basic underlying problem. It fosters the illusion that we are somehow good because we are dressing up for God. It is a study in pretense that is dehumanizing and constitutes a false witness to the world. And I just pulled up a graphic with this passage or this verse, Matthew 19:17. And he said unto him, Why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is God. But if thou wilt enter into life, keep the commandments. So now let's talk about what these first century Christians did. And I know that some of you who have been following along or with this series are probably thinking, oh, she's bringing up the first century Christians again. Yes, I am, because the first century Christians were the ones who were living with the fellowship and the community that the Bible called them to do. And so I truly believe that even though it's been, 2,000 years since this time period, and obviously some things are going to need to change, I think that we can do better in the way that we are fellowshipping and the way that we are worshiping. And I think that it's certainly worth looking back at how they did things. On page 149, it says, the first century Christians did not dress up to attend meetings. They met in the simplicity of living rooms. They did not dress to exhibit their social class. In the church, all social and racial distinctions are erased, or at least they're supposed to be. If we go to James 2, verses 1-5, it says, My brethren, do not hold your faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ with an attitude of personal favoritism. For if a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes in a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay attention to the one who is wearing the fine clothes and say, You sit here in a good place, and you say to the poor man, You stand over there, or sit down by my footstool, have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives? Listen, my beloved brethren. Did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? So in this passage, James rebuked the believers who were treating the rich saints better than the poor. And he boldly rebuked the rich for dressing differently from the poor. In the church, there is no division. Well, again, there should be no division between social and racial classes. But yet there are so many people who are under the false delusion that it is irreverent to dress in informal clothing when attending a Sunday morning church service. And this is not dissimilar to how the scribes and the Pharisees accused the Lord and his disciples of being irreverent for not following the traditions of the elders. So, and we can find that in Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through, what am I going to do? Well, yeah, we'll just do 13, because even though this in itself is not speaking of clothing and what you wear, it is, however, a passage in which it shows that the Pharisees are accusing Jesus for not following their traditions which were not based in the Bible. And if we can parallel that with so many people who look down on those who just wear their normal everyday clothes or whatever they have, in many cases that's because that's all they have, into the church service, and the people who are looking down on them are imposing their traditions on these believers, traditions that are not rooted in Scripture. So in Mark 7, chapter 1, it says, The Pharisees and some of the scribes gathered around him when they had come from Jerusalem, and had seen that some of his disciples were eating their bread with impure hands, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they carefully wash their hands, thus observing the traditions of the elders. And when they came from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they cleanse themselves. And there are many other things which they have received in order to observe, such as the washing of cups and pitchers and copper pots. So as you can see, these are the traditions of the elders. These are not the traditions of the law that they were given by God. Verse 5, the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat their bread with impure hands? And he said to them, Rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far away from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. Neglecting the commandment of God, you hold to the tradition of men. And isn't that what people do? What very legalistic, pharisaical people, when it comes to clothing, among many other things, do? They are upholding the tradition of men while neglecting the commandment of God. And starting with verse 9 again, it says, "He was also saying to them, 'You are experts at setting aside the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. For Moses said, Honor your father and your mother, and he who speaks evil of father or mother is to be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father or his mother, Whatever I have that would help you is Corban, that is to say, given to God. You no longer permit him to do anything for his father or his mother, thus invalidating the word of God by your tradition, which you have handed down, and you do many things such as that.'" That's true. There are so many traditions that are not biblical, that are handed down through the generations as if they come from Scripture when they do not. So now we went over the attire of the, quote, laity. Now let's start addressing the attire of the, quote, clergy. So many people don't realize this, but Christian clergy did not dress differently from the common people until the coming of Constantine. On page 250, it says, "Contrary to popular opinion, clergy apparel, including the ecclesiastical vestments of the high church tradition, did not originate with the priestly dress of the Old Testament. It rather has its origins in the secular dress of the Greco-Roman world." Clement of Alexandria argued that the clergy should wear better garments than the laity. And despite what it shows in this painting of him here, Clement actually said that the minister's clothes should be simple and white. Oh, it was page 150 before. Now we're on 151. It says, "White was the color of the clergy for centuries. This custom appears to have been borrowed from the pagan philosopher Plato, who wrote that white was the color of the gods. In this regard, both Clement and Tertullian felt that dyed colors were displeasing to the Lord." Then with the coming of Constantine, there began to be made distinctions between the bishop, the priest, and the deacon. And the clergy was now started to be identified by the clothing, by the robes, by the garb that they wore. And the garb that this clergy wore, they matched that of secular officials. And even when the clothing style of the laity started to change and they started to wear like shorter tunics, and they also were not wearing such long robes, the clergy itself actually kept the outdated garments during the church service because they followed the model of the secular court ritual. And again, they wanted to be distinguished from the laity. And what better way? The laity is now all of a sudden wearing these shorter tunics. And here we have now these bishops and these priests and these deacons that are still wearing these long robes, all more to divide them from the laity, those who, were in the more secular arena, common people. From the 5th century onward, bishops wore purple. So I guess by then it was okay to not only dye the garments, but also to dye them in what was that actually a very expensive dye. But from the 5th century onward, bishops wore purple. In the 6th and 7th centuries, clergy garb became more elaborate and costly. Yeah, have you ever seen what the Pope wears in the Vatican and what, I don't know, are they archbishops that are in there with him? I'm not Catholic, so I don't know. It's just the amount of money that must be put into these vestments that they wear is just outrageous. Anyway, by the Middle Ages, their clothing acquired mystical and symbolic meanings. Again, not to pick on the Catholic Church, but the hats, I don't know what they call them. They are reminiscent of the fish hats that were worn by those who worshipped the Ninevites. And I believe that they worship Dagon. There's another name for him too, but this is a pagan god. And so these hats, they come from these pagan religions. And actually I think it's the staff, one of the staffs that the Pope uses, it actually has Egyptian symbology on it. So this is still going on today. So this is true when it says that their clothing acquired mystical and symbolic meanings. Special vestments were spawned around the 6th and 7th centuries, and there grew up the custom of keeping a special set of garments in the vestry to put over one's street clothes. then the Reformation happened. And during the Reformation, there was a break from tradition and the clerical vestments, and it didn't happen overnight, but eventually the clergy vestments of the Reformationists, they actually adopted the scholars' black gown. So if you see these clergy in these, they call them higher church services. There's higher church and lower church. Higher church is usually those more liturgical church services, where lower church is typically more like the evangelical churches, where they're a little bit less formal, don't really wear robes. But the Reformationists, if you see them in these black robes, that's what those are adopted from. They are adopted from the secular scholars' robes during that Reformation period. On page 153, it says, "Black soon became the color of every minister in every branch of the church. The black scholar's gown eventually evolved into the frock coat of the 1940s. The frock coat was later replaced by the black or gray lounge suit of the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, many clergymen wore white collars with a tie. In fact, it was considered highly improper for a clergyman to appear without a tie. Low church clergy, Baptists, Pentecostals, etc., wore the collar and necktie. High church clergy and Anglicans, Episcopalians, Lutherans, etc., adopted the clerical collar, often dubbed the dog collar." And as we're talking about this, I want you to just keep in mind that there was no distinction between clergy and laity in the first century church. There was no one person who was like placed over the entire church. Remember, the church was that they all participated in these church meetings. There was no one person who did the preaching every single week and who was kind of in charge. This was an every member functioning sort of church in the first century. So, to not only go from they didn't have anyone who was constantly leading their services, only one person every week. Then on top of it, there's a further division here by not only now having one person who is basically the boss of the church, if you could say it that way, they now also distinguish themselves even further by dressing in a way explicitly to make themselves look different from the other believers. And in this way, it does kind of put them on a pedestal, and it creates this hierarchy that was never there in the first century. There's an interesting section. It's actually the last section in this book that I'm going to share with you. It's on page 154. And it says, "Especially attired clergy is an affront to the spiritual principles that govern the house of God. It strikes at the heart of the church by separating God's people into two classes, professional and non-professional. Like dressing up for church, clerical clothing, whether it be the elaborate vestments of the high church minister or the dark suit of the evangelical pastor, is rooted in worldly culture." Going to just interject here that I know that not all evangelical churches are like that, because I go to one, and it's not usually a suit. It's just normally just everyday clothes. Not a t-shirt, but like a button-down shirt, and a pair of khakis, and a pair of jeans. But anyway, so just remember, I realize that there's what do they call it? Like a scale. I can't even think. Well, wait till I tell you about what I went through last night. If you stick to the end of the video, you're going to get to hear about that fiasco, which is why I'm not able to think right today. But anyway, we're almost done with this, I promise. So, the distinctive garb of the clergy spectrum. That's the word I was thinking of. There's a spectrum. I know that not all churches are exactly the same. So we're just talking about the basic types of churches here. But I know that there are different churches. Anyway. The distinctive garb of the clergy goes back to the 4th century, when clergymen adopted the dress of Roman secular officials. The Lord Jesus and his disciples knew nothing of wearing special clothing to impress God or to distinguish themselves from God's people. Wearing special garb for religious purposes was rather a characteristic of the scribes and Pharisees. And neither scribe nor Pharisee could escape the Lord's penetrating gaze when he said, Beware of the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and love to be greeted in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. So we're into the delving deeper section at the end of the chapter where they will usually list some questions that people maybe have sent in and then they reply to them. And so I have one starred here that I'm going to share with you. And this one says, you imply that people should never be encouraged to dress up for church. However, for me, doing so serves as a reminder that we should give God the respect he deserves. In this sense, isn't wearing good clothes to church a positive thing? And they replied, if you feel that dressing up for church gatherings is a positive thing and you can do it unto the Lord with pure motives, then by all means do so. But we should be careful not to judge or look down upon those who do not dress up for such gatherings. And I agree with that 100%. So the next chapter, here, and I did tell you that I would tell you, those of you who are still sticking around, what happened. So I was going to record 2 videos last night. I usually record 2 videos like 4 days a week. So I usually record about 8 videos a week. I was going to record 2 of them yesterday. Well, first of all, last Friday, I just picked up my granddaughter. She weighs all of 20 pounds and threw my back out. I mean, it was really bad. And then it took several days for it to, start healing. Yesterday, it was mostly starting to feel better, but then just starting to have some twinges here and there. And then all I did was sit down. Just sat down. I must have sat down too fast. I don't know. I threw my back out even worse than I did on Friday. I was in excruciating pain. This happened about 11:30 in the morning. I was just in excruciating pain, like grunting every time that I had to move to walk, or I could barely walk. Like I really could barely walk. Took Tylenol and it did not help me at all. So I took a shower, managed to get up the stairs to my shower. I don't know how I did it, and had the hot water on my back and then cooled it down. It helped a little bit. So I'm like, okay, I'm upstairs. I'm going to go lie down in the bed. Well, I fell asleep for 2 hours. That was the worst thing I could have done, because when I woke up, I was in pain 12 out of 10. It was bad. So then I went downstairs, and that was when I finally texted my husband, and I was like, can you please come home from work? I said, I really need to go to urgent care. I said, I cannot stand this anymore. And by this point, it was 5:30, and he called me and he said, I'm so sorry. I just pulled all this stuff out and I started doing a new project and I have everything everywhere. So he called one of our sons, who we knew was home from work, but unfortunately who lives half an hour away. And so he got him to come pick me up because I didn't want to drive because I could barely move. And so he took me to urgent care and I had to get a shot and all this other stuff. And thankfully I'm starting to feel a little bit better today, but they gave me a muscle relaxer and it really makes me groggy. So I'm probably not even thinking straight today. I've been a little slow all day, and I should have taken it hours ago, but I was like, no, I am not taking it until I do these videos. So anyway, that is my story. There's always something going on in my life. I'm serious. The next chapter is called Ministers of Music, Clergy Set to Music. This one is going to be very interesting for me to present because my daughter's father-in-law is the music director for our church. He is very, 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 very passionate about music. So yeah, I'm going to be very careful about how I present this one. Anyway, that's all that I have for you today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave one down below. And if you like my work and would like to become a channel member, I will leave a link in the description box for that as well. Or you can just click on it right on my channel page. And I hope you have a great day.